There are moments in life so sharp they cut the rest of your days in two, before and after. This story lives entirely in the after. A lone woman, a dying fire, a bleeding stranger who should have been her enemy. One night in 1882, in a rotting trading post on the Arizona High Plains, Evelyn Whitlock had to decide whether to pull the trigger or pull the thread. She chose the thread, and that single stitch changed the map of 2 lives forever. Out here, the land doesn't care who you were. It only remembers what you became. The wind on the high plains of eastern Arizona didn't whisper. It snarled. In the fall of 1882, it drove sheets of rain sideways, stinging Evelyn Whitlock's face like thrown gravel. She hunched low over Dusty's neck, the mule's ears pinned flat against the storm's howl. Lightning cracked the sky open, bleaching the world white for an instant, and in that glare she saw it. A squat, crooked shape against the endless flatness. Not trees, not a mirage. A building. Dusty balked, hooves sliding in the mud. Evelyn tightened the reins, her fingers numb inside sodden gloves. "Easy, girl," she murmured, voice lost to the gale. The shape resolved into warped boards and a sagging roof. An abandoned trading post, door hanging by one hinge like a broken jaw. She swung down, boots sinking ankle-deep, and led Dusty toward it. Better than dying out here. Inside, the air was thick with old dust and the faint rot of wet wood. Rain drummed on the roof like impatient fingers. Evelyn struck her last match, cupped the tiny flame, and touched it to the wick of her lantern. Yellow light pushed the shadows back just enough to show leaning shelves, a split barrel in the corner, and gaps between the boards where wind keened like something trapped. She unsaddled Dusty in the driest corner, rubbed the mule down with a threadbare blanket, then wrapped herself in the same wool, shivering. The Colt revolver lay heavy in her satchel. She kept one hand near it. 2 years since Eli Boone died in the red dust near the Brazos, his body riddled with arrows the survivors swore were Apache. She had buried him herself, hands raw, throat rawer. Since then, she had ridden from one cattle town to the next, stitching bullet holes and delivering babies for people who looked at her with gratitude that never quite hid suspicion. No home, no one waiting, just the next storm, the next night alone. She told herself this was only shelter for one night. Tomorrow she would ride on. But the truth sat cold in her chest. There was nowhere left that wanted her. Thunder rolled closer, shaking the walls. Dusty shifted, blowing softly. Evelyn rose to check the door, still holding against the wind, when she heard it. Not rain, not the mule. A slow, deliberate thud. Boots. Heavy boots. The doorway went black. A shape filled it, massive, blocking the storm's gray light. The man was shirtless despite the cold, broad chest glistening with rain, and something darker. Long black hair clung to his shoulders. He held one hand pressed to his side. Even in the lantern's weak glow, Evelyn saw the slick gleam of blood running between his fingers. He stepped inside. 3 slow strides. The air shrank. Evelyn's hand found the Colt. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Apache. The word burned behind her eyes, bright as the memory of Eli's body in the dust. She leveled the revolver, barrel steady though her arm trembled. The man's gaze flicked to the gun, then to her face. No fear in his eyes, only a steady calm, the kind that belongs to someone who has already measured the distance to death and found it familiar. He spoke, voice low and rough with accent, but clear. "I will not hurt you," he said, "but I need help." Outside, the storm screamed on. Inside, the only sound was Evelyn's breathing and the slow drip of blood on the floorboards. She did not lower the revolver. The lantern flame guttered in the draft, throwing long shadows across the warped floorboards. Evelyn stood frozen, Colt leveled at the stranger's chest, the metal cold against her palm. Rain hammered the roof like buckshot, but inside the trading post the only sound was the slow, wet drip from his side onto the dirt. Blood. Dark and thick. It pooled at his bare feet, mixing with rainwater that ran in rivulets down his legs. He didn't move closer, didn't raise his hands, just watched her with those steady, dark eyes, rain-slick hair plastered to his broad shoulders. Apache. The word lodged in her throat like a stone. She saw Eli again, face down in the dust, arrows bristling from his back, the survivors swearing it was raiders from the hills. Her finger tightened on the trigger. "I will not hurt you," he said again, voice low, rough-edged but calm. "But I need help." The words hung between them. Evelyn's arm ached from holding the revolver steady. Her heart slammed so hard she felt it in her teeth. Every instinct screamed to pull the trigger, end it now, before he could reach for a knife, before the storm brought more of his kind. But another voice, quieter, older, spoke inside her head. The oath she'd taken in Galveston, hands on the Bible, promising to do no harm, even to men like him. She swallowed, lowered the barrel an inch. Not all the way. "Sit," she said, voice thinner than she wanted. "By the lantern." He obeyed without hesitation, lowering himself to the floor with the slow grace of a man who knew pain well. Buckskin clung wet to his ribs. The wound was clean through the side, no exit, deep enough to kill slow if left alone. Evelyn set the Colt on a crate within easy reach, then knelt, keeping her distance at first. She pulled her satchel close. The whiskey bottle was half full, her last reserve for cleaning wounds or dulling her own nights. She uncorked it, poured a stream over the gash. He hissed once, jaw tightening, but made no other sound. She probed gently with her fingers, feeling for lead fragments. None. Just torn flesh and blood that wouldn't stop. "You're losing too much," she muttered, more to herself. She tore a strip from the hem of her own dress, wet, cold cotton, and pressed it hard against the wound. Her hands shook. Every time her knuckles brushed his skin, she flinched, half expecting him to grab her wrist. Outside, the storm roared on, but beneath it she heard something else. Distant hoofbeats, faint, muffled by rain and thunder. Riders, coming closer. He watched her work. When she threaded the needle with gut and began stitching, he spoke again. "Men chase me." She didn't look up. "I heard. Not far." She tied the last knot, cut the thread with her small scissors. The stitches were neat, tight. She wrapped the wound with the last clean rag from her bag. Then she sat back on her heels, breathing hard. He reached into a small pouch at his belt, pulled out a strip of dried meat, tore it in half, and held one piece toward her. "A gift," he said. Evelyn stared at it. Her stomach twisted. Hunger. Fear. Something else. She took it. The meat was tough, salty, tasting faintly of smoke and sage. They ate in silence, the storm rattling the walls around them. He met her eyes across the dim light. "Tomorrow, you ride with me." The words landed like a stone in still water. Evelyn felt the revolver's weight beside her again. She opened her mouth to refuse, but nothing came. Outside, the hoofbeats were clearer now. Steady, purposeful, cutting through the rain. She said nothing. The lantern flame dipped lower, throwing their shadows long and thin against the wall. The riders were coming. The lantern had burned low, its wick a thin black thread curling in the glass. The storm outside had quieted to a low moan, rain reduced to a steady drip from the eaves. Inside the trading post, the air hung heavy with wet wood, blood, and the faint, smoky tang of the small fire Evelyn had coaxed from splintered barrel staves. She sat cross-legged on the rough floorboards, back against a leaning shelf, the Colt resting in her lap like a sleeping snake. Across from her, Alchis leaned against the wall, legs stretched out, one hand resting lightly over the fresh bandage on his side. The stitches held. For now. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, watchful. Dusty shifted in the corner, blowing softly through her nostrils, the only other living sound in the room. Evelyn's eyes traced the scars across his chest. Old knife cuts, arrow marks, the map of a life lived hard and close to the edge. She thought of Eli again. Not the body in the dust this time, but the quiet evenings before. Him reading by lamplight, the wind howling outside their wagon, the two of them safe together. That safety was gone. Had been gone for 2 years. She had patched up strangers in dusty towns, delivered babies for women who crossed themselves when she left, and every night she slept alone with the revolver under her pillow. No one waited. No one would notice if she never rode in again. She looked at the strip of dried meat still in her hand. Tough, salty, real. She took another bite, chewed slowly. Alchis watched her, not staring, just watching, the way a man might watch a river to see if it would rise or fall. "I need a wife," he said at last, voice low, matter of fact. "You need shelter." The words landed flat, no poetry in them. No flowers, no promises, just truth laid bare like a blade on leather. Evelyn's throat tightened. She almost laughed, sharp, bitter, but the sound died before it reached her lips. "I'm not looking for a husband," she said. "And certainly not." She stopped herself. The word Apache stayed locked behind her teeth. He tilted his head slightly, reading the silence she left. "You have no home. That's not your business." He didn't argue. He let the statement hang there, heavy as the damp air between them. She busied her hands, folding the rag she'd used to wipe the needle, corking the last drops of whiskey. Her fingers moved brisk, practiced, but inside her chest something cracked open, a small, tired ache she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. "You said men are chasing you," she said finally. "Yes. They killed Kael, my cousin. Took our horses. I took them back," she frowned. "So they'll keep coming." "For me, yes." His eyes met hers, steady. "But not for you." She understood then. The offer wasn't just shelter. It was a shield. A man like him, tall, scarred, Apache, riding beside her would make most men think twice. But the price... She drew her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. The floorboards were cold through her skirt. "You don't know anything about me. I know you heal. You are not afraid to touch blood. You travel alone. You do not scream when the wind is loud." A pause. "I know enough." She almost smiled, almost. It was the closest thing to humor she'd heard in months, and it wasn't meant to be funny. Dusty blew out a long breath in the corner. The wind outside had dropped to a low whine. Evelyn looked at the revolver in her lap, then at the man across from her. She thought of another night like this. Alone, storm raging, no fire, no company. Eventually another storm would come, and another, until there was nothing left to ride toward. "I'll ride with you tomorrow," she said slowly, "but only until spring. After that I go where I please." He studied her for a long beat, weighing the words. At last he nodded once. "For now." They ate the last of the meat in silence. The fire popped, sending a thin trail of sparks up into the dark. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the night was still black and heavy. Alchis shifted, wincing as he moved. Evelyn pretended not to notice. Dawn would come soon. And with it, the sound of hooves. Closer now, unmistakable. Not thunder anymore. Riders. She lay down on the hard boards, blanket pulled tight, the revolver close. Alchisa stayed where he was, back to the wall, eyes on the door. Neither slept. In the quiet before first light, the hoofbeats grew clearer. Slow, deliberate, coming straight for the trading post. The first light of dawn crept across the high plains like spilled milk, pale and thin, turning the mud of last night's storm into cracked gray earth. Evelyn sat rigid behind Alchis on his paint horse, arms loose around his waist, only when the gait demanded it. Dusty trailed behind on a lead rope, head low, hooves sucking at the softening ground. The air smelled of wet sage and iron, rain-soaked dirt mixed with the faint copper of blood that still seeped through the bandage on Alchis's side. They had left the trading post before the sun cleared the horizon. No words passed between them as they saddled the horses. Evelyn had packed what she could carry. The rest, half her remaining herbs, a tin of salve, the small Bible Eli had given her, she left behind in the dust to lighten Dusty's load. The mule moved slower now, ears flicking at every distant sound. Evelyn felt the loss of those small things like a fresh cut. Alchis rode straight-backed, eyes sweeping the flatness ahead and behind. Every few minutes, he shifted, a small grimace crossing his face when the motion pulled at the stitches. Evelyn watched the dark stain spread slowly across the buckskin at his ribs. She said nothing. Her own hands still carried the memory of his skin under her fingers last night, warm, scarred, alive in a way that made her stomach twist. The plain stretched endless, broken only by low ridges and clumps of yucca. Wind tugged at her hair, carrying the faint, unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats far off to the east. Not close yet, but coming. Alchis spoke without turning. "Kael was my cousin. They killed him for the horses. I took them back." Evelyn's throat tightened. She thought of Eli's wagon, splintered and burned, the survivors babbling about arrows and war cries. "Apache raiders," they'd said. She had believed them because grief needed a face. "Apache raiders?" she asked, voice barely above the wind. He glanced over his shoulder, eyes dark and unreadable. "White men say many things after blood, not all true." The words landed soft, but they stung. She looked away, toward the horizon where the sky met earth in a hard blue line. Part of her wanted to argue, to shout that she had buried her husband with her own hands. But another part, tired, bone-deep tired, wondered if the truth had ever been as clean as the stories people told themselves. They rode on in silence until the sun climbed higher and the horses needed water. Alchis reined in beside a narrow cut where a trickle of runoff still ran. He dismounted first, wincing as his boot hit the ground, then offered a hand to help her down. She took it, briefly, calloused palm against hers. then pulled away quickly. While the horses drank, she knelt to refill her canteen. Alchis stood a few paces off, scanning the back trail. The hoofbeats were still there, faint but steady, like a heartbeat under the wind. Evelyn straightened, wiping wet hands on her skirt. "If we stop too long—" "We don't," he said. "But the horses need this." She nodded, throat dry despite the water. When they mounted again, she urged Dusty closer to the paint. The mule's shoulder brushed the other horse's flank. Evelyn's hand rested lightly on Alchis's back for balance when the terrain dipped. She felt the heat of him through the buckskin, the slow rise and fall of his breathing. It was the closest she had been to anyone in 2 years. She hated how much she didn't hate it. They left the stream behind. Alchis glanced once more over his shoulder. A thin line of dust hung low on the eastern horizon, too deliberate to be wind. Riders. Closer now. He touched his heels to the paint. The horse lengthened stride. Dusty followed without urging. Evelyn looked back once. The trading post was gone, swallowed by distance and light. No turning back. The dust on the horizon thickened, a pale finger pointing straight at them. Alchis did not speak again. He only rode faster. The sun had bled itself dry behind the western ridges by the time they stopped. The Mogollon Rim country had folded into a narrow cut between 2 low swells of rock and juniper, just enough shelter to blunt the wind that still carried the chill of last night's rain. Alchis swung down first, favoring his side, then tied the paint to a twisted pinion. Evelyn dismounted Dusty more slowly, legs stiff from hours in the saddle, and led the mule to the same tree. The animal blew out a long, tired breath and dropped her head to graze the sparse grass. Alchis gathered dry twigs and a few brittle branches, struck flint to steel with a practiced flick. The small fire caught quickly. Orange tongues licking upward, smoke thin and sharp with the scent of cedar. He sat cross-legged on one side of the flames. Evelyn settled opposite, knees drawn up, the colt tucked under the edge of her blanket where she could reach it without looking. The light painted his face in shifting gold and shadow, catching the raised lines of old scars across his chest. They looked like rivers on a map she didn't want to read. Neither spoke while the fire settled. The meat he'd carried was nearly gone. Evelyn broke the last strip in 2 and held half across the flames. He took it without comment. They chewed in silence, the crackle of burning wood the only sound louder than the wind. After a time, Alchis poked the coals with a stick. "The men who follow," he said, voice low. "Ranchers from Texas country. They think I stole horses. They killed Kael to keep them. I took what was ours." Evelyn swallowed the last tough bite. The salt lingered on her tongue. "And now they want blood. They want what they think is theirs." He looked at her across the fire. "They will speak to soldiers at Fort Apache. Words travel fast." She felt the weight of that name, Fort Apache, like a stone in her stomach. Soldiers meant patrols, reports, questions. Questions she couldn't answer without dragging herself deeper into something she still didn't understand. The firelight moved over his scars again. Not the clean cuts of a killer, she thought suddenly. The ragged ones of a man who'd fought and bled and kept going. She remembered Eli's face in the lantern light back when life was still simple. Quiet, kind, gone too soon. The comparison hurt in a place she hadn't touched in years. "My lodge," Alchis said, breaking the quiet. "No man touches you unless I wish it." She met his eyes. "And in return?" "You live." He paused, the words measured. "No storm finds you alone." The promise was plain, stripped of anything soft. Not love, not romance, just survival traded for survival. She felt the pull of it, the exhaustion of endless nights with nothing but wind and her own heartbeat for company. To die out here, unseen, unmarked, no one to bury her. She looked into the flames. "I don't know if I can trust that." "You don't have to trust," he said. "You only have to live through the winter." Evelyn wrapped her arms tighter around her knees. The revolver pressed cold against her thigh. She wanted to ask more, about Kael, about the raids, about the stories white men told and the ones Apache told. But the words stuck. Asking would mean opening the wound of Eli all over again. Staying silent meant riding blind into whatever waited at the camp. She chose silence. The fire burned lower. Alchis fed it one last stick, then lay back against his saddle, eyes on the stars beginning to prick the sky. Evelyn pulled the blanket higher, revolver under the folded edge like a secret. Sleep didn't come easy. Every snap of twig, every distant coyote yip made her tense. In the deepest part of the night, Alchis sat up suddenly. His hand closed on the spear beside him. Evelyn's eyes snapped open. She reached for the Colt. He raised a finger to his lips. She froze. Beyond the fire's dying glow, at the rim of the cut, a shadow moved. Tall, deliberate. Then another. Not coyote. Not wind. Alchis eased to his feet, spear low but ready. Evelyn gripped the revolver, heart hammering against her ribs. The shapes paused at the edge of the darkness, watching. No one spoke. The fire popped once, sending a small shower of sparks into the black. The shadows did not move closer. The morning came cold and clear, the kind of cold that bit through wool and leather alike. The land had begun to rise into low, rolling hills, the first outriders of the White Mountains pushing up from the plain like old, weathered knuckles. Alchis rode ahead on the paint, his shoulders set against the wind that still carried the faint metallic smell of yesterday's rain. Evelyn followed a half-length behind on Dusty, the mule's hooves steady but slower now, ears flicking at every rustle in the scrub oak and juniper. She kept her eyes on his back, the broad line of it, the way he rode without wasted motion even when the stitches pulled. The bandage at his side had darkened again overnight. She told herself it was only the ride, only the strain. But she knew better. The sun had cleared the eastern ridge when the first shot cracked the air. Not close. A warning. The bullet kicked dirt 10 feet ahead of the paint's hooves. Alchis reined in hard. Evelyn's heart slammed into her ribs. Dusty shied sideways, nearly unseating her. She grabbed the saddle horn, knuckles white. 3 riders broke from the cover of a thicket of mesquite 50 yards off, ranch hands by their dusters and the glint of metal on their saddles. One held a rifle leveled. The other 2 had pistols drawn. The wind carried their voices sharp and angry. "Apache thief!" the lead man shouted. "Step down slow! You and the woman both!" Alchis did not move. His hand rested easy on the bow across his lap, the other steady on the reins. Evelyn saw the fresh blood bloom through the buckskin at his shoulder. Another graze, shallow but enough to reopen yesterday's wound. He didn't flinch. She felt the revolver heavy against her hip. Her mouth went dry. These men weren't soldiers, but they carried the same certainty. One Apache, one stolen horse, one white woman riding with him. That was enough for a rope or a bullet. The lead rider spurred forward a step. "We tracked you from the post. You've got no business with her." Alchis's voice cut through the wind, calm. "She rides with me. The rider laughed once, short and mean. He raised the rifle. Alchis moved first. Bow up, arrow knocked in one fluid motion. The shaft hissed past the rider's ear, close enough to part hair. The man jerked back. His horse reared. The other two shouted, pistols swinging, but Alchis had already loosed a second arrow, another warning, embedding in the dirt between them. The riders cursed, wheeled their mounts, and retreated into the thicket. Not far, just out of easy range. Silence fell, broken only by Dusty's nervous snorts and the low whistle of wind through the junipers. Alchis lowered the bow. Blood ran down his arm now, dark and steady. He turned the paint, eyes meeting Evelyn's. "Ride!" She kicked Dusty forward, staying close. When they were clear of the thicket, he slowed. Evelyn dismounted first, hands shaking as she pulled her satchel free. Alchis slid down beside her, leaning against the paint's flank. She tore open his shirt without asking, pressed a clean rag to the new wound. Blood soaked through fast. Her fingers came away red. "You're bleeding too much," she said, voice low. He watched her work, breath shallow but even. "You are not hurt," he said. "That is enough." The words landed soft, almost gentle. Evelyn's throat closed. She wiped the blood from his arm, tied the bandage tight. Her hands left smears on his skin, on her skirt. She looked up at him, really looked, and saw not the raider of her nightmares, but a man who had bled for her twice now without asking for thanks. They remounted in silence. The hills climbed steeper, the air thinner. By mid-morning, the first wickiups appeared on the far slope. Low, brush-covered shelters in a loose ring along a frozen creek, smoke curling thin from the tops. A cluster of older men stood at the edge of the camp, blankets wrapped against the wind. One stepped forward as they approached, eyes narrow on Evelyn, then on Alchis. "The white woman rides with you," he said in accented English. "Why?" Alchis met the gaze without hesitation. "Mine." The word hung in the cold air. Evelyn felt every eye in the camp turn, women pausing at their tasks, children staring from door flaps, dogs lifting their heads. No welcome, no hostility yet, just recognition. She was no longer a stranger passing through. She was seen, and that seeing carried a weight she could already feel settling on her shoulders, like the first snow of winter. The afternoon light had turned thin and gold by the time they crested the last rise. Below them, the winter camp spread along the frozen creek like scattered stones, wickiups of bent willow and brush. Hides stretched tight over frames, smoke rising straight up in the still air from their smoke holes. The smell hit Evelyn first. Wood smoke, tanned hides, roasting meat, and the faint, sharp bite of pine from the surrounding trees. Children, young ones, darted between the shelters, their laughter high and sudden against the quiet. Camp dogs lifted their heads, barking in ragged chorus as the paint and Dusty came down the slope. Alchis rode in without hurry, raising a hand to the cluster of older men waiting near the center. They wore blankets against the chill, faces lined and watchful. Evelyn felt their eyes settle on her the moment she dismounted. Curious, wary, a few edged with something harder. She was the only white woman here. The realization settled cold in her gut. One of the old ones stepped forward, speaking low in Apache. Alchis answered in the same tongue, short and firm. Evelyn caught the word white repeated twice, the tone rising like a question. Alchis's reply was one word: mine. The old man's gaze flicked back to her, measuring. No one moved to greet her. A woman scraping a hide paused, knife still in hand, and stared. Another tending a fire looked up, lips pressed thin. Alquise led the way to a wickiup near the edge of the camp, larger than some, its door flap painted in faded red and black spirals. He held the hide aside. Inside, the air was warmer, smelling of cedar smoke and furs. A bed of soft pelts lay to one side, bundles of dried meat and corn stacked neatly nearby. Weapons hung from the poles, a bow, quiver, short spear, a rifle with a worn stock. "You sleep there," he said, pointing to the furs. "I sleep near the door." Evelyn stood in the entrance, arms wrapped around herself. The space felt too small, too close. She thought of demanding to leave, riding out now, before dark, before the cold deepened. But the wind already carried ice, and the plain behind them was empty for miles. No town, no help. Only the riders who might still be following. Or worse. She stepped inside. Alquise tied Dusty at the edge of camp with the other horses, then returned without a word. He set his spear by the door flap and sat near it, back to the wall. Word spread fast. A boy, Little Fox they called him, limped up soon after, foot wrapped in dirty cloth, blood seeping through. His mother stood behind him, arms folded, eyes narrow. Evelyn knelt without being asked, unwrapped the cloth. A deep cut from flint, red and swollen. She cleaned it with the last of her water, wrapped it fresh from her satchel. The mother watched every move, silent. When it was done, she took the boy's hand and left without thanks. An old woman, Grandmother Wren, stood at the entrance longer than the rest. She said nothing, only looked at Evelyn with dark, steady eyes that seemed to see past skin and cloth to whatever lay beneath. Then she turned and walked away. Night fell quick and hard. Evelyn lay on the furs, blanket pulled tight, the revolver beside her head. The camp quieted. Fires banked low, voices murmuring. Children hushed. Alquise sat near the door, unmoving. Outside, near the central fire, the old ones gathered. Their voices carried on the cold air, low at first. Then one rose sharper. "The white woman heals," the voice said in accented English, loud enough to carry. "But she brings eyes from the fort." Evelyn's breath caught. She lay still, heart thudding against her ribs. Alquise rose without sound, picked up his spear, and stepped outside. The flap fell shut behind him. She stared at the low ceiling of hides and branches, listening to the crackle of the distant fire and the low rumble of voices. The camp had accepted her presence, for now, but acceptance was thin as new ice. One wrong step, one rumor from the fort, and it would crack. She closed her eyes, but sleep stayed far off. In the dark, she felt the weight of every gaze she'd met today, the unspoken question hanging over her like smoke. "How long before you bring trouble we cannot fight?" Alquise did not return right away. The fire outside popped, sending sparks into the night. Somewhere a dog growled low. Evelyn's hand found the revolver again, fingers curling tight around the grip. She waited. The morning light seeped through the gaps in the wickiup's hide walls, pale and cold, carrying the sharp smell of frost and wood smoke. Evelyn knelt beside Alquise on the furs, unwrapping the bandage she'd tied the night before. The stitches on his side had held, but fresh blood had seeped through during the night, dark spots blooming like spilled ink. She worked in silence, fingers steady from long habit, though her pulse beat hard against her throat. Every touch reminded her of the distance she'd crossed, from stranger to this, kneeling in an Apache lodge, tending a man the world called thief and killer. Alquise sat still, breathing shallow, eyes on the door flap. Outside, the camp stirred slowly. Women tending fires, children's voices thin in the chill air. Then a dog barked once, sharp. Another joined. The sound swelled into a frantic chorus. Hooves thudded on frozen ground. Voices rose, English, rough and angry. "Alchiz! Come out, you son of a bitch! You and that white woman!" Evelyn's hands froze. Alchiz rose without a word, bow already in his grip. He stepped to the flap, pushed it aside just enough to see. Evelyn followed, heart slamming. At the camp's edge, 6 riders sat their horses, ranch hands by their worn coats and the rifles across their saddles, one wearing a faded blue kerchief that marked him as from Fort Apache's outskirts. Camp dogs circled, snarling. Old ones gathered in a loose line, blankets thrown back to free their arms. Hide workers gripped knives and short clubs. The air crackled with the promise of violence. The lead rider, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, spat into the dirt. "We know you took those horses, and now you've got a white woman playing squaw. Hand her over, or we burn this camp to the ground." Alchiz's voice carried clear and low. "She rides with me." The rider laughed, cold. "She's coming with us. Ain't no white woman safe with your kind." Evelyn felt the camp's eyes turn to her. Old ones watchful, hide workers tense. If she stepped forward now, denied him, claimed she'd been taken against her will, she could save her name, her color, her chance to ride back to towns where people still looked at her like a nurse, and not a traitor. But Alchiz would be taken or killed. The camp would pay the price for sheltering him. And her. She swallowed once, then she stepped out beside him. The cold bit her face. She stood straight, revolver heavy in her skirt pocket, though she didn't draw it. The rider's eyes locked on her. The scarred man sneered. "He saved my life," she said, voice carrying across the frozen ground. "Leave." A beat of silence. Then the rider laughed again. Short, ugly. He raised his rifle. "You're as gone as he is." The shot cracked. The bullet passed close enough to lift strands of her hair, the whine sharp in her ears. Evelyn flinched, but didn't fall. Alchiz moved faster than she expected, his arm shoving her down hard into the dirt, body shielding hers for the heartbeat it took to knock and loose an arrow. The shaft struck the scarred man's saddle horn, splintering wood. The horse reared. The rider cursed, yanking reins. The others wheeled, firing wild, one bullet kicking snow near the nearest wickiup. But Alchiz had already drawn another arrow. The riders broke, spurring back toward the ridge, shouting threats that faded into the wind. Dust settled. The camp exhaled. Evelyn pushed herself up on shaking arms. Her palm came away wet. Blood from a shallow graze across her knuckles where a splinter of rock had cut her when she fell. She stared at it, red against pale skin. Alchiz stood over her, bow still in hand, breathing steady despite the fresh blood on his side. He offered no hand to help her up, just looked down, eyes dark and unreadable. "You chose," he said quietly. The words landed like stones in still water. Evelyn sat there in the dirt, blood on her hand, the camp silent around her. The old ones watched, no suspicion left in their faces, but no warmth either. Only recognition. She had stood with him, publicly, irrevocably. She could never ride back to a town now without whispers trailing her. Traitor, squaw man's wife, the white woman who chose the Apache. The name she'd carried. Evelyn Whitlock, nurse, widow. felt like something already buried. Alquise turned back toward the wickiup without another word. Evelyn stayed on the ground a moment longer, staring at the blood on her palm, feeling the cold seep deeper than the wind ever could. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called once, harsh, lonely. She rose slowly, wiped her hand on her skirt, and followed him inside. The flap fell shut behind her. The days blurred into a rhythm Evelyn had not expected. Dawn came sharp and cold, frost rhyming the wickiups like sugar on dark bread. She woke to the low murmur of women starting fires, the scrape of hide being stretched, the distant whinny of horses. Each morning she stepped outside to find someone waiting, quiet, watchful, holding out an injured hand or a fevered child. Gray Bear was first that week. The old man came at midday, arm wrapped in filthy buckskin, the wound beneath swollen and hot, pus weeping yellow. He sat without speaking, eyes fixed on the far ridge as though the pain belonged to someone else. Evelyn knelt in the dirt outside Alquise's lodge, boiled water over a small fire, and cleaned the festering cut with the last of her carbolic solution. She lanced it carefully, drained the poison, packed it with clean cloth. Gray Bear grunted once when the knife bit, then nothing. When she finished, he looked at her, not with gratitude, but with something closer to appraisal, then rose and walked away. Little Fox returned the next day, limping less, the cut on his foot closing clean under her stitches. A young girl with a burn on her palm followed, a hunter with a twisted ankle. Word moved through the camp like smoke. The white woman healed. Not perfectly, not without pain, but steadily. Alquise stayed near, not hovering, just present, sharpening arrows by the fire, mending a bridle, watching without comment. She caught him once giving the best cut of roasted venison to Grandmother Wren, placing it in her hands without fanfare, then walking away before she could speak. Another time he knelt with a cluster of young ones, showing them how to fletch an arrow, his voice low and patient. The sight of it, his scarred hands gentle on a child's, caught in her chest like a thorn. The nights were harder. Sleep came in fragments. She woke often to the wind rattling the hides, to the low voices of old ones around distant fires. Rumors drifted back. The riders had reached Fort Apache. Soldiers might come. A few hide workers still watched her with narrowed eyes, hands lingering near knives when she passed. She felt their doubt like a draft through the walls. Her satchel grew lighter. Ointments gone. Bandages torn into strips and used again. She learned words. Pain, wound, fire, thank you. Halting at first, then smoother. Each one chipped away at the wall between her and the camp, and she hated how much she needed them. One evening, Alquise brought her a skewer of meat still sizzling from the fire. He sat beside her outside the lodge, the flames throwing light across his face. "You work as healer for my band," he said. She took the meat, warm against her cold fingers. "I work to live." He looked at her then, not the steady gaze of protection, but something quieter, deeper. It lingered a moment too long, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. That night the camp slept under a sky thick with stars. Evelyn lay awake, listening to Alquise's even breathing near the door. Then a sound, sharp, sudden, cut through the quiet. A low groan from the edge of camp. Alquise was on his feet in an instant, spear in hand. Evelyn rose, pulling her blanket around her shoulders, revolver in her other hand. She followed him out into the dark. At the rim of the wiki-ups, a lone rider lay sprawled in the snow, face down, coat torn, blood black in the moonlight. One of the men from before, the scarred one who had fired the shot that grazed her hair. Alchis knelt, turned him over. The man's eyes fluttered open, breath ragged. He looked up at Evelyn, recognition flickering through pain. Alchis rose, spear loose in his grip. He looked at her. "He lives or dies," he said quietly. "Your choice." Evelyn stared down at the man who had called her traitor, who had shot at her without hesitation. Her hand tightened on the revolver. Then she set it aside, pulled her small knife from her belt, and knelt in the snow. The blade caught the moonlight, cold and bright. She did not look up at Alchis. She only began to cut away the blood-soaked cloth. The camp remained silent around them, waiting. The night was moonless, the cold so sharp it felt like breathing glass. At the rim of the winter camp, where the wiki-ups gave way to open snow and scrub pine, the scout lay crumpled in a dark heap. His coat was torn open, blood black and spreading beneath him like spilled ink on white cloth. The same man who had fired the shot that grazed Evelyn's hair days before, scarred cheek, blue kerchief now soaked and ragged. His breath came in wet, ragged gasps. Alchis stood over him, spear loose in his right hand. Evelyn followed close behind, blanket clutched around her shoulders, the small knife still in her belt from the lodge. Old ones gathered in a half circle, holding pine pitch torches that spat and hissed in the wind. Hide workers stood farther back, hands on knives or short clubs, faces carved from the same cold stone. Camp dogs circled at the edges, low growls rumbling in their throats. The scout's eyes fluttered open as Alchis knelt and turned him onto his back. He coughed once, blood flecking his lips, and focused on Evelyn. Recognition flickered. Fear, then something like grim amusement. Alchis rose. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "He lives or dies. Your choice." The words hung between them like smoke. Evelyn felt every torch-lit eye on her, the old ones watchful, the hide workers tense, Grandmother Wren standing silent at the outer ring, her gaze unreadable. If she walked away now, let him bleed out in the snow, the camp might breathe easier for a day. No report to Fort Apache. No soldiers riding in at dawn. But the man would die by her inaction, and whatever thin thread of mercy she still carried, the same thread that had made her stitch Alchis in the trading post, would snap. She knelt in the snow. The cold soaked through her skirt instantly. She set the blanket aside, pulled her knife, and cut away the sodden layers of his shirt and coat. The wound was low in the belly, deep, ragged, probably from a fall or a branch in the dark. Blood welled steady, dark and thick. She pressed her palm to it, feeling the heat of life slipping away under her fingers. Grandmother Wren stepped closer, holding a torch lower. The light caught the scout's face, pale, sweating, eyes fixed on Evelyn with a mixture of hate and pleading. Evelyn reached for her satchel, fingers numb. The last spool of gut thread. The final swallow of whiskey. She poured it over the gash. The scout arched, a strangled sound escaping his throat. She threaded the needle, hand steady now from long habit, though her stomach turned at the smell of blood and rot. She worked in silence, stitch by stitch. The camp watched. No one spoke. Only the crackle of torches and the scout's labored breathing filled the night. When the last knot was tied, she sat back on her heels. Blood coated her hands to the wrists. She looked up at Alchis. "He lives," she said. Alquise studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. He spoke low to the nearest hide workers in Apache. 2 men stepped forward, lifted the scout under the arms and knees, and carried him toward an empty wickiup at the camp's edge. The old ones dispersed slowly, torches guttering as they walked away. Grandmother Wren lingered longest, her eyes on Evelyn, searching, weighing, before she too turned into the dark. Alquise crouched beside her. "You heal even enemies." She wiped her hands on the snow, the red turning pink, then vanishing into white. "I heal to remember who I am." He did not answer. He only stood, offered his hand. She took it, calloused palm against her blood-smeared one, and let him pull her up. They walked back to the lodge in silence. The camp settled again, fires banked low, dogs quieting. Evelyn lay on the furs, staring at the low ceiling, hands still stinging from the cold and the work. Morning came gray and heavy. She stepped outside to check the scout. He was awake, propped against a rolled blanket in the borrowed wickiup, face ashen but eyes clear. When she entered, he looked at her. Long, strange, almost grateful. "They're coming," he whispered, voice cracked. "Bigger group. For the thief. And the white traitor." Alquise, standing in the doorway behind her, heard every word. His face darkened, jaw tightening. The scout's eyes flicked to him, then back to Evelyn. She said nothing. She only turned away, stepping past Alquise into the cold morning light. The threat was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the camp now, to all of them. And the wind carried the faint, distant sound of hooves, still far, but coming. The morning broke, brittle and gray, frost thick on the grass like scattered glass. Alquise woke Evelyn before first light, voice low in the dimness of the wickiup. "We go for deer," he said. "Winter meat." She rose without protest. Sleep had been shallow anyway. Snatches broken by the scout's labored breathing from the far lodge and the echo of his whispered warning. She dressed quickly, pulled on the heavy wool coat she'd carried since the plains, and stepped outside. The camp was still quiet, only the soft crackle of early fires and the restless stir of horses. Alquise waited with 3 ridge hunters, lean men with faces painted in streaks of black and red, bows slung across their backs, spears in hand. They mounted without ceremony. Evelyn swung up on Dusty, the mule's breath steaming in the cold. Alquise led them out of camp, down the slope, and into the low hills where the white mountains began to rise in earnest. Suang Mu clung thick to the ground, turning the world soft and muffled. Swallowing sound. They rode in silence at first. The hunters fanned out, eyes scanning for sign. Broken twigs, fresh tracks in the frost. Alquise stayed close to Evelyn, his paint horse stepping careful. She noticed how he favored his shoulder now. The bandage beneath his buckskin darkened again from yesterday's strain. He scanned the fog constantly, bow never far from his hand. One of the hunters spoke low, pointing to a patch of churned earth near a fallen pine. "Horse tracks, not ours. Fresh." Alquise nodded once, no more words. The fog carried faint sounds, wind in the pines, the distant crack of a rifle far off. Practice, maybe. Or warning. They found the deer herd mid-morning, a small group grazing in a shallow draw where the mist thinned. The animals lifted heads at the rider's approach, ears forward, then bolted in a quiet rush of hooves and white tails. The hunters spread wide, silent signals passing between them. Alquise motioned Evelyn to stay back, then urged the paint forward, spear ready. She held Dusty steady, heart thudding. The herd surged, scattering through the draw. A big buck broke away, antlers wide, charging straight toward her position. Dusty danced sideways. Evelyn gripped the reins. Breath caught. The buck lowered its head, steam bursting from its nostrils, hooves thundering. Alchis was there in an instant. He drove the paint between them, leaning low, spear thrusting deep into the buck's shoulder. The animal bellowed, stumbled, veered off into the mist. Alchis reined hard, the paint sliding on frost-slick grass. He swayed once in the saddle, hand pressing his shoulder, blood fresh through the buckskin. Evelyn kicked Dusty forward. "You're bleeding again." He shook his head, short. "It is nothing." "It's not nothing." Her voice cracked. She dismounted, pulled him down with her. He let her, though his jaw tightened. She tore open his shirt, saw the old stitches torn wide, new blood mixing with old. Her hands moved fast. Clean rag, pressure, fresh bandage from what little she had left. Dusty shifted nervously beside them. The other hunters were already dressing the kill farther down the draw. Alchis watched her work, breath shallow. When she tied the knot, he spoke quietly. "You are not hurt. That is enough." The words echoed from before, simple and heavy. Evelyn's throat closed. She looked up at him, really looked, and saw the lines of pain around his eyes, the quiet resolve that had carried him this far. She wiped her bloody hands on her skirt, stood, and helped him back onto the paint. He accepted the aid without pride or shame. They rode back slow, meat bundled on pack horses. The fog lifted as the sun climbed, revealing the camp below. But from the ridgeline, a thicker dust rose, larger than before, 10 or 15 riders, some in faded blue coats that caught the light like distant warnings. Old ones were already gathering at the camp's edge when they arrived, faces grim. One turned to Alchis, voice low. "They want the thief and the woman who stands with him." Alchis dismounted, favoring his side. He looked at Evelyn, eyes steady but shadowed. "We fight or run," he said. "Your place?" She stood there, reins still in her hand, Dusty blowing warm against her shoulder. The camp waited. The dust cloud drew nearer, slow and deliberate. She did not answer. Not yet. The wind carried the faint, unmistakable sound of bugles, distant but closing. The council fire burned high that evening, flames leaping from a stack of dry pine logs in the center of the camp. The light reached far enough to touch the nearest wickiups, turning their brush walls golden and black. Smoke rose thick and sweet with cedar, carrying the smell of roasting venison from earlier in the day. Hide workers and young ones stood in a loose ring around the fire, faces half lit. Camp dogs unusually quiet, lying with heads on paws. No one moved much. The air felt heavy, waiting. Alchis sat cross-legged on a blanket near the flames, spear laid across his knees. Evelyn sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, the heat of the fire warming one side of her face while the night's chill pressed the other. She kept her hands folded in her lap, revolver hidden beneath the folds of her skirt. The scout's words from morning still echoed in her head. Bigger group, thief, and white traitor. She had chosen to stay, to heal, to stand. There was no leaving now, not without dragging the camp down with her. The old ones formed a half circle facing the fire. One elder, face lined like cracked earth, spoke first in Apache, voice low and measured. Alchis translated quietly for her, words clipped. "They say the riders sent a message through the scout. Give you up. Give me up, or they burn the camp." Another elder shook his head, gesturing toward Evelyn. His tone sharpened. Alkeis's jaw tightened. "He wants you gone," he murmured. "Says you bring soldiers. Says the fort will come for the white traitor." Evelyn felt the eyes on her. Some wary, some angry, a few simply tired. She had healed their people, but she was still white, still outside. The wind shifted, carrying a faint, distant smell of wood smoke that wasn't from their fires. Someone burning brush miles away, or perhaps something worse. She rose slowly. The movement drew every gaze. Her legs felt unsteady, but she stepped forward into the full light of the fire. "I heal your people," she said in English, voice clear though it trembled at the edges. "I stay." Alkeis translated, his tone steady. The elders listened. One nodded slowly. Another spoke, and Alkeis relayed it. "Because you saved the scout. Because you did not let him die. They will let you stay. Not welcome, not embraced, just allowed." Grandmother Wren stepped forward then, holding a folded deer-hide coat, soft, tanned, edged with simple beadwork. She placed it in Evelyn's hands without ceremony, eyes meeting hers for a long moment. No smile, no words. Just the coat, heavy and warm. Evelyn draped it over her shoulders. It smelled of smoke and earth. Alkeis rose beside her. He spoke to the elders, voice firm. "She is mine," he said. "We protect what is ours." Then, in the firelight, he reached for her hand. Evelyn hesitated. Only a heartbeat. Then let her fingers close around his. Calloused palm against hers. Warm despite the cold. The gesture was small, public, final. No kiss. No declaration. Just hands clasped before the fire, witnessed by the camp. The elders murmured among themselves. One nodded once. The circle loosened. People drifted back toward their lodges. Fires banked low. The night settled again, quieter than before. Evelyn and Alkeis walked back to their wickiup in silence. She kept the coat on, its weight a reminder. Inside, she lay on the furs, revolver close. Alkeis sat near the door as always, bow and spear within reach. Midnight passed. The camp slept. Then, hooves. Not distant. Close. Many. Alkeis was up in an instant, weapons in hand. Evelyn rose, coat still around her shoulders, revolver gripped tight. She followed him out into the dark. At the camp's edge, shapes emerged from the night. 10, maybe 15 riders, torches flaring. Leading them, a man in blue uniform, officer's bars glinting. He reined in, voice carrying sharp across the frozen ground. "Surrender the Apache and the woman!" The words hung in the cold air like smoke. Alkeis stepped forward, bow raised. Evelyn stood beside him, revolver steady in both hands. The camp stirred behind them. Old ones, hide workers, young ones peering from door flaps. No one ran. No one hid. The officer's torchlight flickered across their faces. There was no more road back, only forward, into whatever came next. The dawn came hard and colorless, the sky a flat sheet of iron over the white mountains. Frost clung to every blade of grass and the hides of the wickiups, glittering faintly as the first light touched them. At the camp's edge, 15 riders had formed a loose half-circle, horses stamping restless in the cold. Torches still burned in their hands, though the sun was rising, flames snapping in the wind. The officer in front, blue coat, brass buttons dull, sat tall in the saddle, rifle across his pommel. Behind him, men in civilian coats and army-issue hats leveled weapons at the camp. Alchis stood before his lodge, bow already drawn, an arrow nocked. Evelyn stepped out beside him, revolver in both hands, the weight familiar but heavier than ever. Old ones flanked them, blankets thrown back, knives and old rifles in their grips. Hide workers and ridge hunters formed a ragged line, faces set. Camp dogs raced back and forth, barking frantic, teeth bared. The officer raised his voice, carrying over the frozen ground. "Surrender the thief and the traitor woman, or we burn the wiki-ups!" Young ones were already being herded inside lodges, mothers pulling flaps shut. A few lingered at the edges, wide-eyed. The wind carried the smell of pine pitch from the riders' torches, acrid and promising. Alchis did not move. Evelyn felt the camp's eyes on her. Waiting. Weighing. She had no name left in the white world. Traitor. Squaw man's wife. The words had already been spoken. Standing here meant they were true. The officer spurred forward a step. "Last chance," he fired, a warning shot over their heads. The crack split the air. Alchisa staggered half a step. A bullet had grazed his calf, tearing leather and flesh. Blood welled dark against the buckskin. He did not cry out. Evelyn dropped to one knee beside him, ripping cloth from her skirt to press against the wound. Gunpowder smoke drifted across them, bitter on the tongue. Dusty reared at her picket line, eyes rolling white, nearly breaking free. Grandmother Wren shoved a fleeing young one back toward a lodge and stumbled when a stray shot kicked dirt near her feet. She caught herself on a post, breath sharp, but did not fall. Evelyn rose. The revolver shook in her hands, but she lifted it high and fired once into the sky. The report echoed off the ridges. "He saved my life!" she shouted, voice raw. "We're not thieves!" The officer laughed once, short, cold. He raised his rifle again. Alchis loosed an arrow in the same instant. It struck the officer's horse high in the neck. The animal screamed, reared, and crashed sideways, throwing its rider into the dirt. The line of horsemen faltered, horses sidestepping, men shouting. Old ones and hide workers opened fire, arrows hissing, rifles cracking. One rider slumped, clutching his shoulder. Another's horse bolted riderless. The riders broke. They wheeled, firing wild as they retreated toward the ridge, torches dropping and guttering out in the snow. The officer scrambled up, cursing, mounted a spare horse, and spurred after them. Dust and gun smoke hung thick in the air. The camp fell silent, except for the low whimper of a child and the labored breathing of the wounded. Alchis leaned on his spear, blood dripping steadily from his calf. Evelyn knelt again, binding the graze tight. Her hands were steady now, but her eyes burned. The riders were gone. For now. But the officer's voice carried back one last time, faint, across the distance. "This isn't over. We'll return with the regiment." The words faded into the wind. The camp stood motionless. A few hide workers sat heavily, clutching wounds, deep cuts from ricochet, one man holding his side where a bullet had passed through. Near a wiki-up, a young one clung to his mother, sobbing quietly because a shot had grazed her arm, blood staining her sleeve. Evelyn looked up at Alchis. He met her gaze, face drawn with pain but calm. No one spoke. Smoke from the dropped torches drifted low across the snow, thin and gray. A raven called once from the ridge, harsh and lonely. The camp waited, silent, for what would come next. The thaw came slow and reluctant, as if winter were an old dog unwilling to rise from its bed. Snow softened first along the creek banks, then melted into thin ribbons of water that cut dark paths through the white. The air smelled different: raw earth, wet pine needles, the faint green promise of new shoots pushing beneath the last crust of ice. In the White Mountains, the camp stirred with the quiet urgency of people who knew the land would not wait. Women folded hides into heavy bundles, tying them tight for the travois. Men checked pack horses, tightening cinches and balancing loads. Children darted between the tasks, carrying small bundles or chasing camp dogs that snapped at melting snow. Evelyn worked alongside the hide workers, rolling blankets, packing dried meat and corn into parfleches. Her hands moved steady, though they ached from the cold and the scars that still marked her knuckles from the stand weeks before. A thin white line across the back of her hand, a permanent reminder of the shot that had come too close. Alchis moved among the horses, checking hooves and cinches, his limp slight but noticeable. The wound in his calf had closed, but the shoulder still pulled when he lifted anything heavy. He did not complain. He never had. She watched him from across the camp, the way he spoke low to the animals, the way he paused to help an elder adjust a load. The sight no longer surprised her. It only deepened the ache in her chest, the knowledge that she had chosen this, irrevocably. Her satchel was lighter now. Most of the medicines gone, used on wounds and fevers through the long winter. She left behind what little remained of her old life: a tin of salve, a worn handkerchief, the small silver locket Eli had given her years ago. It slipped from her fingers into the melting snow as she packed, sinking out of sight before she could reach for it. She stared at the spot a moment, then turned away. The locket was gone. So was the woman who had worn it. Rumors moved through the camp like the wind. Scouts had seen soldiers gathering at Fort Apache. More men, more horses. The old lands might be claimed before summer. Waterholes could be guarded. Old ones spoke in low voices around the last fires, worrying about meat and grass if they were forced to run again. Evelyn stood at the edge of the camp, looking back toward the plain they had crossed months ago. Staying here meant waiting for the regiment, for fire and bullets and no mercy. Moving meant the long road, risk of ambush, hunger, exhaustion. But staying alone meant dying alone. She turned. Alchis was there, leading Dusty saddled and ready. He offered his hand without a word. She took it, letting him pull her up behind him on the paint. The mule followed on a lead. She leaned close to his back, speaking low enough for only him to hear. "I'm not staying because I'm yours," she said. "I'm staying because you're mine, too." He did not turn. He only nodded once, slow and certain, and closed his hand over hers where it rested against his side. His grip was firm, warm despite the chill. Grandmother Wren approached then, holding a small necklace of braided leather and a single turquoise bead. She placed it around Evelyn's neck without ceremony, fingers brushing her collarbone. The bead rested cool against her skin. A quiet mark. Final. The column began to move. Travois creaked and scraped over the softening ground, horses blowing plumes of breath. Children ran alongside, then climbed onto packs. The wickiup stood empty behind them, smoke holes dark. Evelyn looked back once. The camp was already smaller, fading into the white and brown of the hills. Soon it would be nothing. A circle of trampled grass, a few scattered ashes. Gone, as if it had never been. From the far ridge, A thin line of dust rose, too straight, too deliberate to be wind. Riders. Not close yet, but following. Alchis felt her tense. He did not speak. He only urged the paint forward, keeping pace with the column. Evelyn tightened her grip on his coat. The necklace bead tapped softly against her chest with each step of the horse. The plain opened wide ahead, horizon unbroken. They rode on. The dust behind them thickened, slow and patient. The column moved slow across the open plain, a thin, dark line threading through grass still pale from winter. Travois scraped behind the horses, poles groaning under bundled hides and meat. The white mountains had fallen behind them now, reduced to a jagged blue shadow on the horizon. Ahead stretched nothing but sky and earth meeting in a hard, unbroken line. No fences, no roads, no markers. Only possibility, and the wind that carried the smell of new-turned soil and distant rain. Evelyn sat behind Alchis on the paint, arms around his waist, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing against her chest. Dusty followed close on the lead rope, head low, hooves steady but weary. The mule's coat was matted with sweat and dust. She had carried more than her share. Evelyn's hand rested lightly on Alchis's side, careful of the shoulder that still pulled when he turned too quick. His limp was faint when he walked, but she saw it every time he dismounted to check a cinch or help with a travois. The scars he carried, on his body, in the quiet way he scanned the back trail, were not the kind that healed clean. She looked down at her own hand, the thin white line across the knuckles where the rock splinter had cut her during the stand. It no longer bled, but it would never fade entirely. A small, permanent mark, like the one left when she had lost Eli's locket in the melting snow, like the absence where her old name used to live. Evelyn Whitlock, nurse, widow, outsider. That name had no place here. She had traded it for something heavier, something that fit the weight of the coat Grandmother Wren had given her, the bead necklace that tapped softly against her chest with every step of the horse. The camp had lost more than wickiups in the fight. One shelter had burned when a dropped torch caught dry brush. A hide worker walked with a limp from a bullet that had passed through his thigh. A mother carried her young one closer now, the child's arm still bandaged where a ricochet had grazed. No one spoke of it much. They simply moved on. From the rear of the column, a thin thread of dust still rose, distant but persistent. Not wind. Riders. Maybe scouts. Maybe the regiment the officer had promised. Alchis glanced back often, eyes narrowed against the glare. The young ones were quieter than usual, clinging to their mothers or riding double on pack horses, laughter rare. Evelyn pressed her cheek against Alchis's back, feeling the warmth of him through the buckskin. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of sage and distant thunder. "I was not running anymore," she said softly, words almost lost to the wind. "I was riding towards something worth keeping." Alchis did not turn. He only reached back, covering her hand with his own. His grip was firm, calloused, steady. No words, just the clasp of fingers, the rhythm of hooves beneath them. Grandmother Wren rode nearby on a small gray mare, blanket wrapped tight. She glanced over once, eyes meeting Evelyn's. Dark, knowing, carrying the weight of everything she had seen. The first night in the trading post, the stand at dawn, the slow turning of a stranger into something else. She said nothing. She did not need to. The look was enough. Witness, memory, quiet acceptance. The plain rolled on, vast and indifferent. The dust behind them thickened slightly, still far but coming. Alchis spoke once, voice low against the wind. "We see what comes." Evelyn did not answer. She only tightened her hold on his hand. The column continued, small and determined against the endless horizon. Hooves drummed steady. Travois creaked. Wind whispered through the grass. No victory waited at the end of this road. No clean triumph. No safe harbor. Only survival. Hard won and scarred, and a future that remained as wide and uncertain as the land itself. The dust on the back trail drifted higher, catching the light like a slow-rising smoke signal. They rode into it anyway. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully, only to support production, while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.